McCraw by Lin. I am President of Texas Trial Lawyers Association, and we are here opposed to the bill. This bill is designed to thwart the contract between sophisticated parties. That's what we're dealing with in this particular situation. I agree it does apply only to commercial situations. Okay, it delays the owner's case or their arbitration in the event of a defect, but not the contractors. In other words, if you're the contractor, it's a heads I win, tails you lose situation, the way they set it up in here. It requires, well, first of all, understand that in our state, a contractor doesn't have to have any particular license whatsoever, none. But it requires a professional engineer to inspect and put a report together of defects, even if they're open and obvious. Didn't paint it right. Ended up structuring a building, and so you funnel water back into the building. Something along those lines. Something that's open and obvious. You have to have a professional engineer under this bill. The most important problem with this bill, though, is the cure issue. In these contracts, since these contracts are between sophisticated parties typically, in these contracts, most of them already have cure provisions in them. This cure provision would take over what is negotiated between the parties and require 150 days cure period. Now, that's going to result in delays in finishing projects for like schools, churches, hospitals, and commercial buildings, apartments, that sort of thing. It's also going to lead to additional damage due to delay in two different areas. First would be to the project itself. If you have a water issue, for instance, in this 150-day period, if nothing happens, which in my experience in dealing with a lot of situations, med mal and otherwise, the more time you give them, the more delay they take, and essentially nothing happens. In that situation, we're going to have additional damage due to water, ice, snow, etc., and the person who is contracting for that facility is not going to have the use of that facility. Now, it's going to end up slowing payment to subs, probably, if we end up in a dispute, and they're going to be more likely to have to institute mechanics liens and that sort of thing. Their deadline for mechanics liens is 120 days from the time period they finish their service. And if we have a 150-day issue here that they get to inspect and this cure period, if that ends up happening, we're going to have more of those filed, more collateral litigation. The most daunting problem of the cure period is there's a dismissal provision in there that will allow dismissal with prejudice for both the court case or an arbitration, and that's if a school, church, hospital, or other commercial entity won't or can't deal with the delay. In other words, some of these commercial folks are going to say, it is too important for me to finish this project to get those kids in school. It's too important for that to happen, and if I have to give up my right to go after the contractor for this poor construction, I have to do it. For those reasons, this bill it's just. I mean, I understand the intent. The intent is to give some opportunity to cure, but these, like I said, these are sophisticated parties. They negotiate all of this. There's no reason that we shouldn't let the free market negotiate this because we're dealing with sophisticated parties.
Okay, sir, your time's expired.
Thank you.
Ma'am, question? Yes.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Mr. McCraw, I think you might be misinterpreting the bill. This is not about the construction that is underway. Are you aware of the statute of repose for construction contracts?
I am.
And it is how long?
Currently, it's 10 years.
It's 10 years, and so this is really more about the project that is well past construction, maybe in year 9, where someone proposes that they'll find a defect, and they find defects, and then they sue without notice of a right to cure. This is not about during the construction. There are obviously contractual relationships which handle those types of things during construction.
This bill does not address whether it is pre or post construction. In fact, it indicates that this even deals with remodels, and that can happen at the same time. It's simply not tightened up. It doesn't indicate that this is for post construction remedies that occur years later.
But you would agree that it could, that the bill as it's written applies for the full period of the statute of repose.
It could apply to both that and the period of construction, and that is the problem.
Okay.
That is the problem.
Okay.
And sir, I heard your testimony about a cottage industry. I'm not aware of any.
Well,
cottage industry,
I can tell you there is a cottage industry that's going on, particularly in the public schools, and they're going into public schools and they're saying, if you'll employ us, we'll find the defects, we'll sue everybody, and then we'll collect you some money. And that's been going on now for about 8 or 9 years. So it is happening.
I understand your position, sir.
Representative Collier, question?
Yes, sir. Lynn, thank you for bringing up these concerns, but I do have a couple of clarifying questions because I do see where it says this can be done about a construction defect can be brought out in initial stages of construction. So I see your point, and then it also could be read the way that Representative Workman is. So the language isn't tightened up if the intent is for years later. So I see that. But my question is, so say for instance, we see there's a complaint or dispute about a construction defect,
yes,
and the project has just been completed, and so the owner of the property, the commercial building, says, we see a construction defect, and then they give them the 150 days to cure, and well, they get an engineer. Somebody gets to go in. Does it say who gets to choose who that engineer is? Or
yeah, you have to. The person bringing the claim, the owner, would have to, under this bill, would have to go out and hire a professional engineer, no matter how open and obvious the problem is.
Okay, so they have to hire one.
It's not limited to things that you need a professional engineer for. In other words, it could be something as simple as a coat of paint. It could be something as simple as you use the wrong material. We have contracted for you to use this particular type of insulation, and you chose a different type of insulation. Stuff that you shouldn't have to have a professional engineer to deal with defects that are open and obvious.
Okay, so then that's a cost that the complainant would have to incur in order to substantiate their claim for a construction defect.
Yes.
And so that's an added cost. All right, so I see that. So if I have to get an engineer, but years later, so under the statute of repose, we have 10 years, and we come back and see that there was another defect. Does the engineer have to look for all defects or just the one that you think is there? And then are they going to be able to use that piece of paper that the person had that said, we only see this one defect, we don't see another defect, and then years later the person can stand behind it and say, oh, well, see, your engineer only found that defect, so we couldn't, there probably wasn't another defect.
It's a little bit unclear, but I believe the way it would happen, if you had a hidden defect,
mm-hmm,
okay, and your professional engineer could not have found it the first time, and then all of a sudden, water damage builds up over time or something along those lines.
But you had to prove that they couldn't have found it.
And exactly. You have to do under the statute. You've got your statute of limitations from when you knew or should have known of the problem. So you're going to have to prove when you knew or should have known of the problem, and all of that has to happen within the statute of repose. It has to happen within the 10-year period currently.
Yeah. So I'm concerned that this may be used as an opportunity for someone to say there was no defect because we looked at it. But I understand what you're saying is that you can say, well, he couldn't have discovered it or she couldn't have discovered it because of this.
I think it would be a proof issue at that point. And,
okay,
and yeah, it is something that could be brought up, absolutely.
And then I remember in my area, we had the Allen football stadium. It's not like in my district, but it's not in my area, but the Allen Stadium had a crack in it.
Well, that's very much in my area. I'm from McKinney. My office is in McKinney. That stadium, my son played a football game there right before they put it off limits.
Mm-hmm.
And the problems that they ran into, they had enormous cracks that were developing in it. And as I understand it, there was at least a suggestion that some of it was design issue and some of it was construction issue. So there was a lot of give and take. I'm not even sure if that litigation's been settled yet.
So it did go into litigation.
I know that there were claims that were made. I have no idea how they came out.
Okay.
I wasn't involved in it.
And I'm trying to. It would give them 150 days to try to cure it under this bill before they would go into litigation.
And the problem with the Allen one, at least, it was considered so dangerous that they wouldn't even allow people to go in there and continue to play ball and that sort of thing. That's the problem with the loss of use. If you're going to have a statutorily mandated cure period, when that happens, you are statutorily saying you may not be able to use that facility for the purpose for which you bought it or which you built it during that time period. And that's what I meant about having, you can have losses there.
Right.
And you could have losses continuing because the problem could continue to get worse during the cure period.
That's right, because if I'm the owner and I choose to fix it on my own, and then I can go get the bill and try to argue that later on, so that way I don't have too much of a loss of use period. But this doesn't even give you that opportunity. Instead, you would have to wait the 150 days or however long it takes for them to cure it if there is a defect that is found.
As a practical matter, one of the problems that you run into oftentimes in these situations is that there's a loss of confidence. If you've contracted for something, you're not getting what you contracted for. At some point, there's a loss in confidence, and a lot of people that want to cure it would rather have somebody else cure it than the person who messed it up to begin with. And that's that is like I said, a choice they have to make, and then it creates issues for them at trial, but that's their issues if they want to take it.
I do like the concept, though, of them trying to cure it without having to go to litigation. I do like that concept. I'm just not sure if it's there yet, but I want to be able to try to avoid litigation, and I think that's what the whole intent of this bill is to give them an opportunity to fix any problems without having to go to court and save some money. But I'm not sure about the 150 days. Maybe we can look at that, but I do like the concept of trying to work it.
Yes, I was just going to point out, Representative Collier, that the ability to sue earlier doesn't speed up getting it fixed. In fact, if anything, the ability to sue now is going to make it take longer in order to get it fixed, because you're going to begin into litigation and you've got discovery and all of that. And so this is really intended to try to help get things fixed quicker. In the Allen football stadium, that was post-construction, and what did they do? They brought in a registered professional engineer who surveyed the deal, did a report, and then they took about trying to get it fixed. So this is exactly what this is trying to do.
Well, what I was saying is, say for instance, I don't have time to wait for you to fix it, and if I want to go ahead and hire somebody else to fix it, and then part of my damages is the cost that I had to fix it. So that's what I'm thinking some people would opt to do, but this would require them to try to do the remediation without them trying to step in and fix it themselves. I
think if there's a real problem and you've got an emergency situation, you need to take care of it. I think that's clear. So if it's not that, then the contractors and subcontractors and architects and engineers that did the original design should have an opportunity to look at it and try to take care of it before it winds up in litigation.
Sure, and I like that concept, but would you be willing to consider something where if the owner of the building wants to cure it themselves and it takes longer, they can get it done faster? Maybe they can do that? I would
be willing to consider something that was related to an emergency situation.
Okay.
So if we have a roof leaking, that needs to be fixed, then we certainly would be willing to consider something like that.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, members? Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Chair would like to call now.